My Life in Wrestling, Chapter 2, Michigan. Angelo Poffo and I left to Michigan in April of 1963, where we started working for Bert Ruby. Bert's partner in the territory was Jack Britton, who controlled all the midget wrestlers, such as Fuzzy Cubit and Little Beaver. Bert and Jack had an office at the Eddystone Hotel, and across the street was another hotel called the Paul Revere Hotel, which is where I stayed. Michigan is where I dropped the Hurricane Hart name and officially became Playboy Gary Hart. I was excited to finally be using the name and added the Playboy in homage to my hometown, Chicago, where Playboy magazine was based out of. One night, Angelo and I were in Akron, Ohio. Bear and alligator wrestling were scheduled for the evening, but the guy that was supposed to wrestle them didn't show up. The promoter, Pedro Martinez, told me that if I would wrestle the bear and the alligator, I would get an extra $50 payoff. At the time, I was making $25 a night, so I jumped at the chance to make more money. Before the match, the bear's trainer told me to stay behind the bear and ride him, and that eventually the bear would reach back and flip me over. Then we could go around like amateur wrestlers. So I went out there and did what he said, and I actually had a pretty decent match with the bear. The trainer told me that the alligators have tremendous power closing their mouths, but almost no power at all opening them. I was assured that he would be cold and sleepy when the match started, so I was to immediately jump on his back and half Nelson him, keeping my hand over his mouth so he couldn't raise it. When the time came for my match with the alligator, his box was put in the ring, and the trainer started pounding on the sides. That was the cue for the alligator to crawl out. They kept hitting the box, but there was no sign of an alligator. They finally tipped the box on the second rope, and out slid the alligator. Immediately, I jumped on his back, clamped his mouth shut, and started rolling around with him. He was completely unresponsive, so I got off the alligator, grabbed him by his tail, and pulled on him a little bit. At first, the audience was grasping ooh and ah, but eventually the match started going nowhere quick. So I eventually rolled the alligator over and covered him for the pin. After I pinned him, I got up, and the alligator stayed on his back. It turns out I had been wrestling a dead alligator. If that wasn't enough, the people started booing me because they thought I had killed it. To top it off, Pedro Martinez didn't want to pay me the $50 because the alligator was dead and the match didn't count. When I demanded my money, he taunted, "What are you talking about, punk?" I pulled out a razor and said, "I'm going to take this razor and cut you across the top of your head." I always carried a razor with me and had used it in scuffles. I did not like being intimidated or messed with, and I would have no problem cutting him for my $50. He sensed that I was prepared to do it, so he immediately gave me my money, but I was still pissed. Before Angelo and I left that night, I grabbed a car jack and broke his headlights, front windshield, and the rear window of the hearse that Pedro Martinez rode in. He was so fat that he actually rented a hearse and had someone chauffeur him around while he slept in the back. After what I did, though, there was no way that fat bastard would be able to get any sleep during his trip back to Cleveland that night, but that's what he got for trying to stiff me. During the summer of 1963, Angelo quit wrestling because he had accepted a gym teacher position at a school in the south side of Chicago. I was sad to see him go because he had afforded me a great opportunity in wrestling. I will never forget how much he did for me. Once he left, though, Bert Ruby encouraged me to go around and wrestle as a single. At the time, Bert had guys like Leapin' Larry Shane, Louis Klein, Crybaby George Cannon, Flying Fred Curry, Gino Brito, and Jim Myers on his roster. The only one that really caught my eye was Jim, but he had already had a tag team partner and manager named Louis Papagino. Louis had a heart attack and died. And that was when I made my move. Jim had been wrestling for 1 year, and since I had been around the business for 5 years, Bert was pleased that I offered to take him under my wing. Although Jim was interested in having me manage and develop his career, he made it clear to me from the get-go that he was not interested in becoming a full-time wrestler. His main love was teaching, which is what he did during the work week. Wrestling came second. I had a clear understanding of that from the beginning, but still, I saw something incredibly special in Jim and was determined to develop his career so he could fully realize his potential in the wrestling business. We were an odd pair, to say the least. I was a street kid from Chicago who used to run with a mob, and he was a college graduate from Michigan State, a teacher in the Detroit school system, and 6 years my senior. Boy, does that sound like a buddy film gone wrong, or what? It actually surprised me that we clicked together so good, because we bonded really quickly and became the most unlikely of friends. Jim and I spent a lot of time together, and really traveled together a lot. I would pick him up at school at 4 p.m. We would drive to whatever town we were supposed to be in that night, and after the matches, we would be back home by 2 a.m. The next day, Jim would get up and go to school, and I would sleep all day. At that time, Jim wrestled under a mask and was billed as the student. His gimmick was that he was a student of wrestling, and the announcer, Alan Ruby, who just happened to be the promoter's son, would ask me why I constantly referred to him as the student of wrestling when he never used the hose, to which I would become overly defensive and angrily insist, "He's trying to learn. Give him time. He will develop." Eventually, Jim started using his first hold, a finishing maneuver called the hammerlock. The student would pick up his hapless opponent by the arm and walk around the ring with him, forcing him to submit. I would then jump in the ring, instruct him to drop the hold, and then march over to Alan Ruby's desk and order him to tell the people that the student was clearly learning and that they should shower him with applause and recognition. After I forced him to make those announcements several times, Alan got tired of my bullying, refused to my demands, threw down his microphone, and stormed off the set. That was, of course, the setup for a feud between myself and Alan Ruby. It was the first time I ever had a one hand tied behind my back match. We had that match throughout Michigan, and the audience loved it. It was in Michigan where I realized that I had a knack for coming up with clever finishes, and the other guys in the dressing room quickly picked up on it as well. After hearing me give my ideals to Jim every night, some of the other wrestlers started approaching me to see if I had any good ideals for their matches. Jim pulled me aside one night and told me not to give away my ideals, pointing out that we were competing against them as it was. So if I started giving them my ideals, we would be competing with me to boot. In no time, the student had become a tremendous attraction. And before we knew it, we were Bert Ruby's top heels. Jim and I were so successful that we started to get noticed by promoters from other territories. It was in early 1964 that I was first introduced to a promoter named Jim Barnett, because he had come to Michigan scouting talent for his new promotion that he was starting in Australia that year. Picture Elton John, 20 pounds lighter, and that's what Jim Barnett looked like back then. He wanted to bring me and Joe Myers over to Australia, but we had to turn it down because the tour would interfere with Jim's teaching gig. That was all right because there were other promoters interested in us. Bert ran all of Michigan except for Detroit, which was run by Eddie Farhat, a.k.a. The Sheik. Bert's promotion did air on Detroit television, though. So eventually, the Sheik contacted Bert and asked if he could use me and Jim in the Cobo Arena and on his TV in Windsor, Canada. Bert agreed, and the Sheik started booking us regularly. Since we were Bert Ruby's guys and not the Sheik's, some of the guys on his crew would look down on us. That was because Bert Ruby's promotion was looked as a minor league, and I understood that. When I went to work for Bert after leaving Chicago, I considered it a step down because he didn't use the NWA logo, the NWA champion, and like I mentioned earlier, didn't even run Detroit. Lord Athen Layton had been a wrestler of some note in the Toronto area, and he ended up becoming the announcer for the Sheik. From day one, Lord Layton treated me and Jim like we were second-hand trash because we worked for Bert Ruby. He walked around like a big shot and treated Jim and I like a couple of local yokels. Jim and I didn't care, though. We just ignored him and anyone else who looked down on us for association with Bert and focused on getting ourselves over in Detroit. For one particular television taping, Jim and I came up with something to really get some heat. The student was wrestling a young kid, and he would constantly throw him out of the ring so I could get some cheap shots in from along the ring. The fans were going crazy, and then suddenly, and completely unbeknownst to me, Lord Layton jumped up from his announcing position and grabbed me, telling me to cut it out or we would get kicked off of TV. This wasn't an angle. This was his ego and sheer dislike for me taking over. However, there was such a tremendous reaction by the fans when Lord Layton grabbed me that the Sheik booked us in a match at the Cobo Arena. The other main event that night was the Student versus Bobo Brazil. Now, the only reason Jim and I got those plum spots at the Cobo was because Sheik had a real bad case of hemorrhoids and needed to have an operation on his ass. His hemorrhoids was so severe that he had to shove a large Kotex up his crack because of the constant bleeding. Since he was going to have to miss one of the shows of the Cobo, he was outwardly telling people that he was worried the show wouldn't draw without him. But he was secretly panicking that someone else would do better business and take his top spot in Detroit. Therefore, the Sheik put me and Jim in the top 2 matches that night because he wanted guys in the main event spots who he felt he could control. Lo and behold, we packed the arena that night. Regardless of how good we did, though, the Sheik quickly pushed us down the card and never capitalized on our main event successes. He definitely continued using us, but would never let us get higher than the semifinal. At the time, Bruno Sammartino was the WWF champion, and he would come into the Cobo Arena every now and then to defend his title. Whenever he would come in, he would be surrounded by an entourage of guys like Angelo Savoldi, Arnold Skolin, and Phil Zacco, and was basically unapproachable. In February 1966, Bruno and his crew saw Joe Myers in the ring as the Student, and were so impressed that they asked him to come to Bruno's territory in Pittsburgh for a weekend. Since I wasn't invited, I didn't go. Jim was stunned when he came back because he had wrestled in a high school auditorium and made $500 each night. In Michigan, meanwhile, we were making $100 a night at the Cobo Arena. Eventually, Bruno asked Jim to wrestle in Pittsburgh full time, promising to only book him on weekends so it wouldn't interfere with his teaching job. Combined with his teaching gig, that guaranteed Jim a great living. Unfortunately, they wasn't interested in me, and Jim asked if I would have any hard feelings if he took the job. Of course I didn't, and felt that whatever was best for Jim was best for me. So after more than 2 years together, Jim Myers and I parted ways. I'm proud to say that we began as friends and parted as friends. And to this day, we're still best buddies and talk a couple times a month. He's the greatest guy you will ever want to meet. Was the first guy in the industry that became close to on a personal level. And is like a brother to me. Of course, after his run in Pittsburgh, Bruno introduced Jim to Mrs. McMahon in the WWF, and Jim became a staple in New York as George, the Animal Steel. Aside from the money, it was completely understandable why Jim wanted to get out of Michigan. With the Sheik as the main event wrestler in Detroit, he would never get an opportunity to move up on the card and would forever be toiling away on the semi-main event. Plus, we didn't know it at the time, but the Sheik was doing everything in his power to keep me and Jim down. Frank Tunney and his nephew Jack used to come to Detroit regularly to scout talent for the promotion in Toronto. Jack Tunney told Jim many years later that he and his uncle had tried to get Jim and I booked in Toronto, but the Sheik kept preventing it from happening. Killer Carl Cox was a major wrestling star and was wrestling for Dory Funk Sr. in Amarillo. He came up to Detroit for a brief tour, really took a liking to me, and asked me if I would be interested in moving to Amarillo. We talked for a bit, and then he put me on the phone with Dory Funk Sr., who asked if I would be interested in wrestling for him. I explained that I really enjoyed managing and developing talent, and I wasn't sure I wanted to make my living solely as a full-time wrestler. Dory Sr. was very blunt and told me that he didn't use managers and wasn't interested in me as a manager, but that he would hire me as a wrestler. Even though I wasn't thrilled with the prospect of going to a territory where I was only getting an opportunity to wrestle, it was time to move on. My experiences with Jim Myers really built my confidence in molding and developing wrestlers, and I loved every second of it. I knew that I would eventually concentrate on managing and developing talent, but for now, my sights were set on continuing my wrestling career in Amarillo, Texas.